McGraw-Hill Professional presents The Definitive Drucker. Challenges for Tomorrow's Executives. Final Advice from the Father of Modern Management. Written by Elizabeth Haas Edersheim. Narrated by Kathleen Godwin. Forward to the paperback edition. Peter Drucker, who was mostly right about everything, was dead wrong on one point. 2 years before his death in 2005, he had volunteered to speak directly to the students of the business school that bore his name at the Claremont Graduate School. They were upset, even marching outside the dean's office, toting placards decrying a decision to put another name on the Drucker School to gain a $20 million gift. "I consider it quite likely that 3 years after my death, my name will be of absolutely no advantage," he told them. "If you can get $10 million by taking my name off, more power to you." Drucker underestimated the enduring nature of his contributions to management and society, as the 10th anniversary publication of The Definitive Drucker clearly demonstrates. In fact, if ever there was a time when a voice of reason was sorely needed, it would be right now, and it would be none other than Peter Drucker's. At a moment when the world seems ever more fractured and polarized, Drucker's thoughtful perspective would be calming, if not reassuring. Luckily, the book in your hands is the next best thing. The Definitive Drucker is a masterwork by Elizabeth Haas Edersheim that smartly distills the wisdom of the most enduring management thinker of all time. First, a confession. As much as I admired Peter, I often felt many of his books were sometimes difficult to get through. They were profoundly thoughtful, but also often dense. What Edersheim has done in what is now a classic work is extract the gems from Drucker's prodigious life with a clarity and succinctness that makes his contributions all the more accessible. So if you want to know what Drucker thought about management or knowledge, the customer or people, innovation or collaboration, these pages bring his ideas alive and prove how relevant they are yet again. As to why Drucker matters, more than 10 years after he died in his sleep, 8 days shy of his 96th birthday, it's simple. His teachings form a blueprint for every thinking leader. In a world of quick fixes and glib explanations, a world of fads and simplistic PowerPoint lessons and tweets, he understood that the job of leading people and institutions is filled with complexity. He taught generations of managers the importance of picking the best people, of focusing on opportunities and not problems, of getting on the same side of the desk as your customer, of the need to understand your competitive advantages and to continue to refine them. He believed that talented people were the essential ingredient of every successful enterprise. The Definitive Drucker is definitive on these points. He was the guru's guru, a sage, kibitzer, doyen, and gadfly of business, all in one. He had moved fluidly among his various roles as journalist, professor, historian, economics commentator, and raconteur. Over his 95 prolific years, he had been a true Renaissance man, a teacher of religion, philosophy, political science, and Asian art, even a novelist. But his most important contribution, clearly, was in business. What John Maynard Keynes is to economics, or W. Edwards Deming to quality, Drucker is to management. Drucker made observation his life's work, gleaning deceptively simple ideas that often elicited startling results. Shortly after Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric in 1981, for example, he sat down with Drucker at the company's New York headquarters. Drucker posed 2 questions that arguably changed the course of Welch's tenure. "If you weren't already in a business, would you enter it today?" he asked. "And if the answer is no, what are you going to do about it?" Those questions led Welch to his first big transformative idea, that every business under the GE umbrella had to be either number 1 or number 2 in its class. If not, Welch decreed that the business would have to be fixed, sold, or closed. It was the core strategy that helped Welch remake GE into one of the most successful American corporations of the past 25 years. Drucker's work at GE is instructive. It was never his style to bring CEOs clear, concise answers to their problems, but rather to frame the questions that could uncover the larger issues standing in the way of performance. "My job," he once lectured a consulting client, "is to ask questions. It's your job to provide answers." While sometimes frustrating for the impatient manager, Drucker's approach was enormously helpful to those he counseled, largely because he was way ahead of the curve on major trends. His mind was an itinerant thing, able in minutes to wander through a series of digressions, until finally coming to some specific business point. He could unleash a monologue that would include anything from the role of money in Goethe's Faust to the story of his grandmother who played piano for Johannes Brahms, yet somehow use it to serve his point of view. Everyone who knew him has a story or two about him, for sure. I first met Drucker in 1985 when I was scrambling to master my new job as management editor at Business Week. He invited me to Estes Park, Colorado, where he and his wife often spent summers in a log cabin, part of a YWCA camp. I remember him counseling me to drink lots of water, to ingest a megadose of vitamin C, and to take it easy to adjust to the high altitude. I spent 2 days getting to know Drucker and his work. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner together. We hiked the trails of the camp, and I became intimately familiar with his remarkable story. Toward the end of his life, I met with him several times, just as Edersheim did for 16 months before his death. During our last meeting in April of 2015, 7 months before he passed on November 11th, Drucker seemed unusually frail and tired in black cotton slippers and socks that barely covered his ankles. I asked Drucker what he had been up to lately. "Not very much," he replied. "I have been putting things in order slowly. I am reasonably sure that I am not going to write another book. I just don't have the energy. My desk is a mess, and I can't find anything." I almost felt guilty for having asked the question, so I praised his work, the 39 books, the countless essays and articles, the consulting gigs, his widespread influence on so many of the world's most celebrated leaders. But he was agitated, even dismissive of much of his accomplishment, not in much of a mood to ponder his legacy. I pressed the nonagenarian for more reflection, more introspection. "Look," he sighed, "I'm totally uninteresting. I'm a writer, and writers don't have interesting lives. My books, my work, yes, that's different. What I would say is I helped a few good people be effective in doing the right things. It's something we all need to learn again." John A. Byrne, former editor at Business Week, founding member of the board of the Drucker Institute. Introduction to the paperback edition. I first met Peter F. Drucker in the winter of 1980 and was both honored and daunted when 23 years later he asked me to write a book about how his ideas could be used in the 21st century. By then, Peter himself had written 39 books, and although by that time 3 books about Drucker had been published, none addressed how to put the observations, wisdom, principles, and practices of the father of modern management to use in this new century. That was what Peter was after, and that's what we set out to do. I spent the next 2 years interviewing Peter and many of the legendary chiefs of industry, finance, nonprofit groups, and countries he had influenced. Our last conversation took place in the fall of 2005, a month before his death. As I sensed that Peter's last days were approaching, I also became more keenly aware of how desperately America and other countries needed business and political leaders to think as Peter F. Drucker always had, with discipline, ethics, responsibility, and reflection, and with the individual, the organization, and society working together. On the day he died, his wife, Doris, called me. She didn't have to say a word. I instantly knew he was gone as I blurted out, "Oh, Doris, his ideas will live on." And as we both began to cry, I knew that what I'd just heard myself say out loud for the first time was absolutely true. Peter continues to be widely quoted and referenced. The annual Drucker Forum attracts leading thinkers from around the world to discuss a selected Drucker topic, such as growth and prosperity. Since the Definitive Drucker's first publication, I have continually heard from readers all over the world thanking me for how helpful the book has been, and how Peter's discipline has helped them elevate their leadership. A woman in Saudi Arabia recently wrote, "It was the education that I never had and needed to grow my business." And when 2 students at Copenhagen Business School recently interviewed me as part of their thesis work, they asked stunningly perceptive questions that Drucker himself surely would have appreciated. Last year, I was asked to write a blog for the Brookings Institution on an education book that had defined the role of education in building Druckerian thinkers for tomorrow. Day after day, I see Peter's inspiration evidenced by leading enterprises, the students I teach, and the clients I have the privilege of working with. Now, 10 years after the hardcover of The Definitive Drucker was published, our world has crossed another, as Peter might say, historic divide, characterized by the sheer quantity, rapidity, and breadth of changes our social, political, and economic landscapes have undergone, alongside the profound leap that technology has taken. It is undoubtedly a new world, and Peter had this to say about organizations in new worlds. If nothing changes, we risk atrophying in our irrelevancy. But if everything changes, we risk losing ourselves in ineffective chaos. The leaders of the institutions most successfully crossing this historic divide appear to be steeped in Peter. When Satya Nadella stepped in as CEO of Microsoft, his first act was to rewrite the mission statement with Drucker rules, centering on the customer instead of Microsoft, and which could fit on a T-shirt. He encouraged people to find ways to connect with customers and do the impossible for them. Jeff Immelt, GE's CEO, has spent his career inside GE, a company where Peter worked closely with the previous 4 CEOs, building a culture that continually challenges assumptions and plays to its strengths. Immelt often asks Drucker's first question, "What needs to be done?" Under his leadership, GE has refocused on the Internet of Industry, supporting GE's being in ahead of other industry policymakers when it comes to climate change. Immelt, who embraces Drucker's value of dissent, is not afraid of taking a position on this that differs with that of the current President of the United States, and he encourages dissent inside the corporation. Zhang Ruimin, the CEO of Haier, the leading global appliance company, has studied Peter since he was a teenager and centers virtually all of Haier's corporate training on Peter F. Drucker. The leaders of new institutions innovating in the new world appear to have an uncanny connection with Peter. Facebook's talent group is steeped in Drucker principles. Spotify's CEO quotes Peter Drucker almost daily. The leaders at Blast refer back to Peter as they make every decision. Peter F. Drucker resonates with social sector leaders as well. Wendy Kopp is one example. Taking on one of the most intransigent sectors, she founded Teach for America and is now scaling social changes to countries around the world, referring to Drucker's lessons along the way. While Peter was intensely interested in management as a profession, he believed that corporations and social enterprises, fast emerging as our most important institutions, had to be both effective and responsible. Otherwise, he warned, we won't have a functioning society. To be effective, Peter emphasized, we need to embrace new realities while holding on to principles and purpose. The first corporation he stepped inside of and wrote about was General Motors. Its current CEO could, I believe, learn much about leading GM tomorrow from the book Peter wrote about Alfred Sloan's leading it in the 1940s. As my young sports management master's degree students at New York University learn about hands-on consulting, I've seen them practice some of Drucker's principles while helping their clients. For instance, by challenging their clients' assumptions and helping them practice abandonment. For example, for many decades, maybe even since the gory displays at the Roman Colosseum, sports revenue has come from people sitting in stadiums and then in front of televisions. One student team proved to its sports promoter client that this is no longer true. That, for example, more people had tuned into the League of Legends World Championship on mobile devices than had watched the 2016 Super Bowl on television. This revelation spurred the client to rethink his revenue model. A decade ago, Peter F. Drucker envisioned this divide I have been discussing here when he said, "We will not know the impact of the Internet until we have observed how behavior changes." Well, we can clearly observe those behavior changes now, and my students who have embraced Drucker's principles of challenging assumptions and abandoning outworn tenets are helping their clients by pointing them out. I am not at all surprised by the continuing relevance of Drucker today. He might, however, be more surprised than I. He had a certain humility, which especially struck me one day as we talked in his home office in the fall of 2005. In his famous Austrian accent, he told me he had no illusions about his legacy. In essence, he felt he would be lucky that if in 10 years he was still footnoted in some management and social science literature, as he believed there were certainly more important, impactful contributions than his. He pointed to the example of his friend Francis Crick, who co-discovered the double helix structure of DNA. But Peter was wrong about his legacy. Peter F. Drucker not only saw what management and leadership of the future would be and require, he also left us the tools to get there, just as his friend Crick gave us tools for modern biotechnology and a future understanding of the mind and consciousness. Peter's words are certainly still relevant, even critical today as we have crossed this divide, have Facebook and Twitter in our daily lives, and see our businesses wrestling with big data algorithms that try to predict consumers' behavior, artificial intelligence, and all the rest. The challenge of the social sector and the information sector working together has never been more relevant, and the challenge of making business more productive and more humane certainly has never been more important. For the sake of the future of our economy, our community, and our society, I believe every thinking manager needs to be familiar with Drucker's discipline of thought and how to put his principles and practices into immediate motion to solve 21st century management challenges. When I finished writing this book, I knew Drucker's lessons would apply far into the future. I am still amazed at his prescience. Knowing and studying Peter F. Drucker changed me, how I work, how I think, the questions I ask. Perhaps most important, Peter made me appreciate the value of context, reflection, and adopting a Druckerian perspective. Whether you are a seasoned practitioner or among the new generation of aspiring leaders, I hope reading this paperback edition of The Definitive Drucker will change you for the better too. Forward. I did not realize it at the time, but I grew up with Peter Drucker. My father spent 25 years in management at GE and another decade at Chase Manhattan. He met Peter at GE's Crotonville facility in the 1950s and always had Drucker's books on his bookshelf. Though I had no interest in business as a high school or undergraduate student, I flipped through my father's books, Drucker classics such as The Effective Executive and The Practice of Management. Later, when I was in the U.S. Navy, I grew more interested in business while running service and retail operations at a U.S. airbase in Japan, and returned to those and other classics. Slowly but surely, I was becoming a Drucker student. Regrettably, I did not take the initiative to meet Peter until 1999. P&G was in the midst of major strategic change and arguably the biggest organizational transformation in its 162-year history. I was then responsible for P&G's North America region, the big home market, and for P&G's new global beauty business. I called Peter and asked if he would meet with me. He agreed, and 4 decades after he and my father had talked at Crotonville, I sat with Peter in his modest Claremont, California home, talking about a world he had been thinking about for nearly a half-century. I had hoped for 1 hour of his time. We talked for 2. Then, when my wife Margaret arrived to pick me up, she came in and we all sat and talked for another 2 hours. It was like drinking from a fire hose. For every question I posed, Peter had 1 or 2 more things to think about. Persistently, he urged me to choose, to focus on the few right strategies and decisions that would make the greatest difference. He challenged me to understand the unique leadership challenges of managing an organization of knowledge workers. That exhilarating first conversation provided the themes Peter and I returned to for the next 6 years. How to unleash the creativity and productivity of knowledge workers. How to create free markets for ideas and innovation inside and outside a company such as P&G. How to build the organizational agility and flexibility to respond to and lead change. Later, we began a conversation about another subject on which he was focused in the last years of his life, the work of the CEO. As I've looked back on these conversations and countless hours reading Peter's books and articles, I've thought about what made him so extraordinary. For me, it comes down to 5 things. First and foremost, Peter's basic rule was the importance of serving consumers. As he liked to say, the purpose of a business is to create and serve a customer, plain and simple. At P&G, we have translated this principle into respect for the consumer as boss. Consumer-driven strategy, innovation, and leadership are cornerstones of P&G's success and a reflection of the influence Peter has had on our company. Second, Peter insisted on the practice of management. He had little patience for detached theory or abstract plans. Plans are only good intentions, unless they immediately degenerate into hard work, he wrote. He and I readily agreed that execution is the only strategy customers or competitors ever see. I always came away from our conversations with clear, fresh insights that I could apply to P&G's business and organization almost immediately. But Peter was not a single-minded evangelist for the virtue of execution. He believed in the power of strategic ideas and making clear choices. He said, "From quiet reflection will come even more effective action." His ability to balance action and reflection is what makes his idea so practical and so enduring. The third characteristic that made Peter extraordinary was his gift for reducing complexity to simplicity. His curiosity was insatiable, and he never stopped asking questions. He called himself a social ecologist because he drew from history, art, literature, music, economics, anthropology, sociology, and psychology. From these many sources of inspiration came the clear questions and simple Drucker insights that lit the road to action. Management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. The only way you can manage change is to create it. The marketer is the consumer's representative. His most enduring gift to future generations is that he taught so many others how to ask the right questions. The fourth defining Drucker strength was his focus on the responsibility of leaders. Late in his life, he sharpened this focus on the responsibility of CEOs in particular. The CEO, he said, is the link between the inside, where there are only costs, and the outside, which is where the results are. For many reasons, business organizations become inwardly focused. Their business and financial measures are internal. Even if they have external metrics, those measures are often given lower priority because they don't drive short-term financial performance or because they are less precise and more qualitative. Peter argued that the CEO is in a unique position to balance this inward focus. The CEO has primary responsibility for bringing the outside in, for ensuring that the organization understands the views of the market, current and potential customers, and competitors. The fifth and most important of Peter's many attributes was his humanity. He treated everyone with deep respect. "Management is about human beings," he wrote. "Its task is to make people capable of joint performance, to make their strengths effective and their weaknesses irrelevant." He noted that business and other institutions are increasingly the means through which individual human beings find their livelihood and their access to social status, to community, and to individual achievement and satisfaction. While he did not suggest that businesses exist to supply jobs, he argued that managers have a fiscal, societal, and moral responsibility to ensure that jobs are fulfilling and individuals are able to contribute as fully as they can. I could not agree more. The most important thing I try to do as CEO is to inspire leaders and unleash the creativity and productivity of P&G's 135,000 knowledge workers. Humanity infused everything Peter wrote and said. He was a force for good in the world. He received the U.S. Medal of Freedom because his management thought, beginning with Concept of the Corporation, helped develop free societies of organizations more productive than dictatorships of the left or right. This is his greatest contribution. Peter Drucker was one of a kind. He was relentlessly focused on the promise of the future and the potential of individuals. It is entirely fitting that one of his final requests was for a biography of his ideas rather than of his life. Liz Edersheim has fulfilled this request with The Definitive Drucker. She has captured not only the essence of Drucker's 39 books and 7 decades of discovery and insight, but also the essence of Peter Drucker the man, the wise, funny, insightful, humble teacher who sat with so many of us in his living room asking questions and patiently giving us the time to catch up to where he had already leaped. The man who helped us see what he always described as visible but not yet seen. Through his example and his ideas, Peter will continue to be a force for good in the world for generations to come. A. G. Lafley, Chairman, President, and CEO, P&G, Cincinnati, Ohio, September 6, 2006. Introduction. Soon after I published a biography of my mentor, Marvin Bower, the architect of McKinsey & Company, the phone rang at my home on a Friday night. "Hello." The caller paused and then added, "This is Peter Drucker." It took me a moment to grasp who it was on the other end of the phone, with his Viennese accent that sounded like my father's. I walked out of the kitchen, away from my family, to clear my head and be alone with this strangely familiar voice. Peter Drucker? The man credited with inventing the discipline of management? The man who wrote 39 books, which have been translated into countless languages? The man who single-handedly counseled the chairman of GM and Ford? Who advised the president of the World Bank and the CEO of GE? Who reportedly told Margaret Thatcher to privatize the entire British mining industry? The man who had a formative influence on every company Jim Collins and Jerry Porras profiled in their book, Built to Last, legendary organizations like Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and Motorola? In what I soon learned was Peter's usual no-nonsense way, he complimented me on my recent Marvin Bower book and asked if I might be interested in interviewing him. Drucker jokingly raised the idea of my writing a book about him, a book looking at how he had created the modern concept of management. I was tempted, not to mention flattered. but commitments ricocheted through my head. In the next few weeks, I had to fly to Brussels for a global meeting at Avon.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?